Hi, everyone. Welcome to another recorded book discussion between the Unerased Book Club and the Ann Arbor District Library. My name is Lucy, and as always, I'm excited to be here with the facilitators of the Unerased Book Club to guide us through some questions about this collection of poetry called A Nail the Evening Hangs On by Monica Sok. And just before we get started, a quick introduction. As I said before, I'm Lucy. I'm a library tech in the youth department at the library. I do youth programming and adult programming. I'm a middle-aged white woman with glasses and brown hair and a blue shirt sitting in front of a wall with watercolor paintings.
Hello, my name is Amanda. I also work at the Ann Arbor District Library and a library technician in the youth department. I do programming for adults and teens, children across the board. And I am also a middle-aged white female. I have shoulder-length dark brown hair, dark glasses. I'm wearing a green t-shirt and I'm sitting in front of a blue couch.
Hi, I am Jacob. I am also an employee of Ann Arbor District Library where I work in the outreach department. I am a white male in his late 20s sitting in front of a white wall in a jean jacket.
Hi everyone, I'm Fatema. I am a facilitator for Unerased Book Club. I am a brown Asian woman, and I have a blurred digital background of my office. So happy to be here with you all.
And hello everyone, my name is Sheela Lal. I am the founder of the Unerased Book Club and co-facilitator alongside Fatema. I am a light-skinned brown woman, Indian Asian, in my early 30s, and I'm sitting in front of a blurred screen of my living room, but we'll probably be changing it to a photo from Cambodia to fit the theme of the set of poetry. And I want to quickly set the scene for the set of poetry that we read as a group. I also want to recognize that this is a smaller group than we normally have, and that is in line with when we read poetry for the book club. It usually is a much smaller group, but in my opinion, that means that we're going to have we have a different type of rich conversation. So we chose A Nail Hangs On, sorry, it's a long title. A Nail the Evening Hangs On, which is a set of poetry by Monica Sok, because we think that poetry is an incredibly important way for us to understand a different reality and a different set of circumstances. But this sets of poetry is specifically around the Cambodian and Cambodian American diaspora experience with respect to a genocide and the trauma that comes after that, and the idea of rebuilding a sense of self and community. So with that, I will just open it up to everyone. What were your thoughts on poetry and on this collection?
Well, I'll start. I literally just finished reading this like a half hour ago. I did a little bit of research beforehand. I didn't want to jump into poems that were very heavy and heartfelt about things I didn't have a lot of details, historical details about, and I wanted to better absorb the emotions and feelings of where the scenes were. And it definitely helped me. And it was it's a heavy book. And I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to read it for this group. And so I'm excited to see what everybody brings to the table for our discussion today. I feel like there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I like you, Amanda, kind of the opposite. While I was reading it, I found myself just constantly looking things up to sort of get a better understanding and to just also sort of give me more layers to what I was reading. And I'm so glad I read this, but I also, for a collection of poetry, I found it really accessible, which I think is great, especially with subject matter like this that I feel like more people should know about. And so I found it, really readable and yeah.
And I think there's also something to say whenever I read a book, whether it's a novel or like this, a collection of poetry, when I finish reading it and I go, I'd like to spend more time with this person. Mm-hmm. Like I would like to know more about their family and their history, even though she shares a good amount. I wanted to spend more time with this person just to see how they see the world. And I was like, well, that's probably the sign of it's something that I really enjoyed or found meaningful. So.
Mhm.
I also, like you, Amanda, read a bunch of things before I went into it because I was like, I don't have nearly enough context for this to be able to really appreciate the nuanced meanings of so many different things. So I appreciated the links that Sheela shared in terms of contextualizing the piece, and it helped me kind of figure out where to begin. I really found myself relating to so many of these things, and then also finding myself feeling like, oh, so many of these things are also so relevant to our context today. And I spent a lot of time reflecting about it, especially in light of recent like legislation that we've been talking about or court rulings and just all sorts of things that could potentially lead its way towards having mosquitoes that she uses it around us. I found a lot of meaning and connection to our present day reality, and also thinking a lot about the role of the US in all of this in Cambodian history, but also just where the histories we're currently impacting. Yeah, I feel like it was so rich.
Yeah, so I was very lucky that I was able to visit Cambodia almost, I guess, 8 years ago now. And I think it's the first and second poems, both Ask the Locals and Americans Dancing in the Heart of Darkness, felt very like visceral to me. This idea that first you can't ignore the violence that's inflicted upon you, and there needs to be an aggressive measure to remind everyone around you that they shouldn't be in your society, or in this case with mosquitoes, ecosystem. And then the second poem is and I think maybe Fatema was alluding to this as being able to relate to it, but such a stark difference between being part of a culture and then being on the outside of the culture, and both of those experiences happening simultaneously in the same space. And so the poem talks about a stampede that had happened in Phnom Penh, and the reaction of the narrator, who's and I'm assuming is Cambodian American based on the context, and then other Americans who may not be Cambodian American, and their I guess like the willingness to distance themselves from the pain and violence, whether it's either immediately with the stampede or the everlasting trauma of being in a country that has experienced not just genocide, but imperialism and other forms of occupation for a very long time.
Yeah, I think that same level of like, non-Cambodians and then people who are Cambodian or Cambodian American showed up again in that longer poem, the Tool Slang, which has like some people who are at this museum to visit a museum, and the way it's described is, these non-Cambodian people like crawling into the spaces that people were imprisoned in and looking at pictures in a different way, whereas there are Cambodians and Cambodian Americans who might be there looking for a picture of somebody that they lost in the prison that's now a museum. And I just think that sort of dissonance, actually, I think it was in a lot of these poems.
In that poem particularly, I feel like there's a lot of like these the dissonance that you mentioned between like the child who sees a school and only a school and runs from room to room versus what it really was as a execution site and a prison and a torture space. It's like torture holding. And I just found like so many of those not necessarily parallels, but I think they were just like oppositions or binaries in her work. And it was fascinating because I think it captures what it means to live in two different spaces whether it's a cognitive space or physical space or historical space.
Well, I think those parallels too are important to like the information and the quote unquote stories she's sharing, because both of those things are existing at the same time. Like, especially the poem that Lucy referenced, Chul Slang, that I don't want to say that was my favorite, but for me, after that one, I was like, whoa, I just had to sit for a while and think about it. And I love the use of like magical realism throughout it. And for me as a reader, I didn't think I really liked magical realism until this year. Or for me, it's a useful tool for just understanding sort of like emotion and describing something that couldn't really be there, but was there. That's sort of very abstract. But for me, that, especially in this poem, like with the boy running around, or later on, there's a woman who she curls up inside of a banana leaf, makes herself really small. Like those little pieces of magical realism really just made the poems like scream even louder to me. I thought so. But as far as the parallels of those two things are existing at the same time, and there's different people, any circumstance that's happening, whether it's good or bad or past or present, any two people are going to have a different response to it. You know what I mean? And so here it's just a way heavier topic. And these two people who are walking through the museum as like a person looking for their relatives who were there, or a person who's just like, drinking their sugar water and then, looking around at like the beds and the chains as a tourist, which is, I mean, that has its place too. But it's a very interesting to read both of those points of view, like in one poem, but is also sort of whimsical in a way. It was a very interesting way. And for me, it was someone mentioned accessible. For me, it made the poems very accessible on an emotional level.
And to piggyback off of what you guys had said, what these poems made me think a lot about, and what it made me ask is the people who are at that museum, who are in that space, they're aware of what it is. They know what happened there. If that isn't enough to, I don't know, if that isn't enough to drive home the severity of the situation or the seriousness of the situation, then how do you get somebody to take that space seriously? Mm-hmm. Or do you see the question I'm trying to ask? Mm-hmm. It's like, if the truth, which is horrific, isn't enough, what is? And then the answer in a way is stuff like art, poetry, music. Mm. I think is one way, but I was left kind of feeling frustrated. How do we get people to care? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Period.
I think like it would be a disservice to the visitors, or perhaps, maybe that's not the right word, but I think it would be like people do feel and do understand the importance of it. But there's a difference between being a visitor versus being someone who lives with the reality, right? So like one of the reasons why fiction or poetry or things that are removed from us, like TV shows, we can have a greater sense of compassion or empathy for those things, because we know that experience is going to be over soon. It's a 90-minute, movie. It's a 25-minute episode of television. And so even if we're seeing really difficult things, we can tolerate it. Whereas if we were to experience it in real life, I feel like we tend to have a much harder time, and perhaps like less empathy or less compassion towards other people around it. And I think the visitors in this case are also possibly like just they're allowed to be in this like temporal space, and then once they're out, they're enjoying the sugar cane and the juice, and they are allowed to leave it behind. Whereas like someone like Monica Sok, she's not able to do the same because she's feeling it on a different level, and the personal connections, the losses of family members, the fact that her entire life is a consequence of that particular trauma. She's not able to leave that behind. So it's almost like two different, experiences.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about that, like the intergenerational trauma that I think runs through a lot of these poems. And so that's like one way that you definitely couldn't leave something behind, even if you yourself didn't experience it. But what's really interesting about this poem is then there's also this next generation, right? Like her nephew is running around in there And it's not to say that he also won't experience intergenerational trauma, because who says when that stops? But at the same time, he's having fun running around this place that's like a school. Like I felt like this poem was like one of those books where I don't, like you see the inside of something. So there's like a sheet and a plastic sheet, and another plastic sheet. So it's like the images change. It's superimposed kind of this. That's how this poem felt to me. Like I was getting all these places stacked on top of each other.
I can only imagine what it's like to read this poetry without any context, like, and without knowing any Khmer Americans, Cambodian Americans, and how disorienting that must feel, to realize like that there's a huge set of people, not just like Cambodians, but Laotians, Vietnamese, and even Thai people who have experienced very violent trauma very recently. And then to dig in a little bit deeper, because there's poetry later on in the collection, like how not just complicit, but active the United States military and foreign policy decision makers were in creating that harm and sitting with that dissonance, again, without like having that interpersonal access to like learn from either experience if you've been to the area or just learning from people in your community. And like it's such a difficult thing to reconcile, and then to read it in beautiful language that not just, it doesn't like give you the harsh truth, but it gives you the harsh feelings.
Yeah. And I think it's almost cheating, like reading this to experience some of the things she was feeling and going through. It's almost cheating, because I'm like, oh, and you feel it, but it's not the same as like, I feel like I need the book like thrown in my face and like, swords to appear like as the book, you know what I mean? I feel like it's cheating reading the book to absorb some of the things she was going through. But at the same time, I did like the guttural like feeling that it gave me while I was reading it. That sounds weird to say too, but I felt like cheating because the words were so beautiful. Like, but I guess that's poetry. I mean, like so much of poetry is dark, and it's a way to express these dark things that humans have trouble, like, observing, living through, processing, living with. And words on a page is a way that the writer can process their emotions, feelings, experiences. And then as an observer or a person trying to learn, it's a way to absorb like new information or a fresh approach on information, which I think it was just really neat to read it as poetry and in the style of accessible poetry that she was writing the stories with.
A question that came up for me as I was reading, particularly about the U.S.'s role in Cambodia, particularly the Cambodian genocide, was that, who gets to be neutral? Because the U.S.'s involvement really spurred from Cambodians' insistence on neutrality between the Indo-Chinese and the Vietnam War and all of that, right? So, and then like subsequently being forced in both directions, and so the U.S. forcing them to move in a certain way versus the Indo-Chinese forces as well. So I was really thinking about that, like who gets to be neutral, because we talk a lot about that, especially with like Switzerland and other spaces. And right now we're talking about it in the context of Russia and Ukraine, and there are countries who are giving up neutrality in a way to take a stand. And so yeah, that was really on my mind as I was reading these.
That is very deep. That had not even crossed my mind when I was reading these. So I was rereading one of the links that we had sent out to the book club to contextualize these pieces. And it's a photo essay that's pulled from a photographer's 30-year-long career documenting Cambodians and Cambodian Americans in Chicago. And one of the things that stuck out to me is I'm pretty confident he's not Cambodian or Thai, but he took Thai for a year, and that's what got him in the door. And it really frustrated me that I have a friend from elementary through high school who's Khmer, and who didn't learn Cambodian and didn't learn Khmer growing up. And so she's learning it now in her late 20s when she has access to those resources. And the reason she didn't learn it growing up is because of like the trauma of genocide and violence. And what does that mean for somebody like her trying to do the same thing? She wouldn't be able to do the same type of work, even though she's from that community. And I'm sure there's like a more eloquent way of saying this, but it just like always sucks to see somebody who's like very divorced from the realities, who like does the bare minimum, gain so much from a community that's still trying to heal and is like still facing immense trauma from now American deportation and immigration services. And that was just, I know Fatema and I've talked about this about like in regards to other communities, but that was a real, just like slapped me in the face. So like Monica Sok does such a great service to herself, her family, and her community because she is part of that experience as either like a descendant of it or hears it, whatever, like, and is able to, I don't know, create like agency for her own narrative.
Yeah, and it's, she probably had to work harder to do that because like doesn't seem like she was ever getting the full story because her parents are not going to talk about this, understandably so, and or if they do, it's in very nuanced ways, or they tell it to somebody else. So it's almost like even though you're a direct descendant of what happened, you still have to do that work to find out what it is that happened, even to the people who are in your family. Yeah.
Actually, I really liked the poems that referenced her family members. The Sestina one because of her mother and their sisters. And I think there was one around like her grandmother as well that reminded. And it was, one of the things that I really like about this collection is that you can see her actively doing the work of interpreting, the work of processing emotions. There's a lot of feelings in this. And I think that's what makes it so accessible, is that she is transparent about it. She's not saying like, oh, here's a thing and this is the thing and it exists because of this. She's actually going through her own processing, and by which allows us to process along with her. And I think that's really cool. But the sisters one, I think that might have been my favorite poem because it just shows you the true, like the intergenerational trauma of it all, but also just all the imagery that is in that one in particular. I think it just, I found it to be very haunting. Yeah.
And I was envisioning them as like young children doing things you do as children as far as to hide, and the way they would like the secret language of communication between two sisters. But I was also envisioning them as like older women, like senior women, like doing their sister thing together. I thought this was one of my favorite poems too, was the sisters.
Yeah. I love this too, because, she calls it Sestina. So she's calling attention to the form right away. And so then it made me think, well, this isn't actually like, it doesn't read like a true Sestina. Why is that? Nothing else in here is really called, doesn't name a form or fits a form. And I watched a little bit of an interview with her, and she was saying, well, she does take, like a Sestina will take the last word of the stanza and then put it in the first line of the next stanza at the end of the line. She didn't do that. She hid the last word. And you can see that she does this. I went through and I looked for all the hidden words, because she was saying that these women, this group of sisters, they could occasionally hide. One of them would hide, and it wasn't really noticeable because there's a bunch of them, and they seemed interchangeable to whoever was watching them. So I just love the fact that she used a form there, and she's calling out the fact that she's using a form, but then she's also like, I'm using this form in my own way to run parallel to what I'm writing the poem about. And I just think that I loved that about that poem as well. that just adds this whole other piece to it for me.
I'm so glad you shared that, Lucy, because I didn't know about that. I didn't know Sistina was a form. And then I love the way she was literally hiding. That's so impactful. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One other poem, somebody mentioned this a moment ago of her doing the work and digging up these things about her family. There was a thing where on the train and she was reading the book and she had to go and teach class. And then you're reading this book about these powerful things and you're reading the book and you're in the world. Then you have to like get off the train and go pretend like you don't want to just go and be in a room alone and sob. And I thought that was really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. It's true. So the work's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to lie. This was one of the harder collections of poetry that I've read. Like in my notes, I straight up say, I don't get this. I don't understand this sudden change. Like in Self-Portrait, I didn't understand the sudden shift from talking about eating the foie gras and throwing up to saying, I'd rather help an orphan girl carry her sister. Or what that line. And I was like, I can like viscerally feel what's happening. I do not understand the choice in making that shift.
That particular poem, I this is what I thought was happening, was that she was visiting Cambodia as a student at that time with that student group, and she's eating, force-fed goose liver.
Mm-hmm.
And as she's eating this delicacy of French, wonderment, it makes her sick.
Mm-hmm.
All the while she feels sick while these things are happening on the street around her. And she's like, what the heck is, I think it speaks to like that dissonance you guys were talking about, like, but that's the best I got.
And that was my interpretation of it too, because she says something, in America, I don't get to do this sort of rich people thing. So she felt weird and guilty. She was sitting there eating this foie gras, which she didn't really want. And then she was embarrassed and she wasn't pleased by the whole experience. And then, so it was sort of a comparison. It's like, I'd rather help an orphan girl carry her sister, which is sort of like, takes her back to like the things that her family, that they went through. Like she'd rather, like, she identifies more with that than this.
Yeah, I really related to that, the whole rich people thing, because, when I was living in Bangladesh and working there and making an American salary, it was just like, I was just extravagantly wealthy in ways that I otherwise wouldn't be. And so that was my first experience of like going to really fancy restaurants and being served things and spending so much money. Like in one dinner, I could spend like the amount of money my family in Bangladesh would spend for like 3 months of rent and food and everything else, right? And it would just be very easy to do. And for me, it would be nothing. And just like that, I remember it, for me, it felt very much like I felt really guilty, but I also felt like I couldn't, and I couldn't ever tell my family about this because it was just too embarrassing in a way. And I got that sense from her where she's the locals across the way playing pool and feeling, and I can feel her internalized shame around the fact that she's sitting outside like this, enjoying this like tiny portion of rich people food, when everybody else is like not at that level. It was just, yeah, I would have wanted to have thrown up too.
The way that I like had to mentally justify that. So when I lived in Sri Lanka, I was paid in dollars, and like in dollars, I was not paid very much, but when you converted it to rupees, I was paid a lot. Mm-hmm. And the way that I justified my salary was I would spend, like if I was going to spend it, I would spend as much of it with local shops as possible, as opposed to big name, big brands, big restaurants, or like the bougie stuff. And also in that case, a lot of tourism was operated by the military. So I was trying to like avoid that route as well. I was like, yeah, I can justify my spending now. So then giving back to the local economy. And it was still like really difficult to reconcile like the type of lifestyle and access I had as a visitor compared to like how I normally live, or what my life would have been like if my family hadn't left India.
Yeah.
I would like to bring up the poem, The Radio Host Goes Into Hiding.
Yeah.
That is one where I vacillated between being like, whoa, I'm feeling stuff, and not having a good clue. Not even having a place to I did the thing where you read it out loud to see if it makes sense out loud. It didn't help me. I'm seeking guidance.
I'm shaking my head very aggressively because I did the exact same thing.
Yeah. It's a very long poem too that spread very interestingly across many pages.
Is there a way I'm supposed to read it?
I don't know. Oh, you mean like linearly the lines, or
Yes.
I don't know.
Like, is there a?
I read it just across the page, but I feel like this poem had me doing a lot of outside extra work. Like, wait, I've got to look that up, and you know, 'cause she talks about that musician in here, and I just got I sensed that it was like obviously coming from within a camp or a prison, and then I was helped a little bit by the poem I Am Roshana, where that's obviously later in the collection. I'm like, oh wait, this is the wife that he doesn't know where she is, right? So, but yeah, there was, I feel like I got bits of that, and then there were pieces where I was like, I don't know.
Is this a broadcast or like pieces, or?
I think that because of the censorship that was happening, particularly a lot of people, so such as the historians or academics or radio hosts or people who would otherwise be obliged to tell the truth or document the truth, went in and, I mean, during the period of genocide, people were taken out of the cities and into the rural areas and forced labor camps. And I think that this is one example of how a radio host went into those labor camps and was documenting, or mentally, at the very least, recording things or maybe passing along messages, but still trying to stay hidden so as not to be killed or worse. I mean, I think that the feeling I got was there's a lot of things worse than death in this particular time period. And so I saw this as yet another example of, what's the word I'm looking for? People who are not just going along with what's happening, resistance.
And just to contextualize really briefly, sorry, for people who may be viewing this later and may not know enough about the Khmer Rouge, a huge part of like the cultural revolution and cultural re-education, as is mentioned in that poem, is really valorizing the lifestyle of the working class. That included education, and anybody who was even perceived to be smarter, and that included people who just wore glasses, regardless of their education level, were then sent to far-flung re-education camps or indoctrination camps, and also known as killing fields, to produce rice and basically say, we are all equal now, we all work in this agrarian society. And so that's where a lot of that comes from. And I learned while reading, I can't remember the name of it right now, but there's a book about the regime that was very educational, that said that a lot of the reason the genocide happened, it wasn't like they were trying to kill their own people. There was this idea, Pol Pot wanted a certain amount of rice produced, and his lieutenants kept saying, yes, we can do that. And what they did instead was, when there were droughts or if there were poor harvests, they would just take parts of rations and fill up the granary, leaving people to starve, on top of all of the other paranoia and other violence that was occurring. So people died purely, a lot of people died due to mismanagement of grains.
Wow. One thing that, like, Fatema, when you were just talking about censorship, it just made me look at this poem totally differently, because I was like, oh wait, maybe those are like those big white spaces are redacted or censored or so yeah.
That's what I was
like
thinking
I don't know why I didn't, you know, it's like you look at something and you're like, oh yeah, there it is. So sorry.
No, I thought that was really cool. I was thinking about that form of poetry where you take like a newspaper article or something and you black out the words to create a poem with the words that are left behind. And you kind of mimic that spacing in there. So that's what I was imagining as I was reading this. It's like, there's a lot that's missing in between here. And we're not quite getting it, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think I like that interpretation, because now looking back at it again, it does look like blackout poetry. And even though it does make sense in a way, well, in theory, it makes sense reading the words as they are, but you can imagine that there's a richer set of words beyond the white space.
Yeah.
Or too, if you think about like a radio broadcast that could cackle or cut out, like those are the white spaces too. Like I was hearing it more of like a loud announcement when I was reading it for the first time with all of those spaces.
Yeah. That's a cool auditory interpretation of it, especially because that particular sound comes up in another poem, right? Where she talks about how like even that, like people turn it off very quickly because they're afraid of being spied on and being thought of as enemies, right? Because everybody's a spy. You don't know who to trust. Yeah.
Like when I was reading it, I was hearing like, even though it's supposed to be, or in my mind, it was a radio announcer speaking the words. I was imagining like a male voice over like a megaphone, like this like barrel sort of like tunnel kind of voice, really loud, that was cutting in and out.
Yeah.
Still couldn't tell you what it all means though. But I don't think, you know, it's hard because she does use those pieces of magical realism, and she's telling how many times do spoons come up in this story, you know, or like a sweet potato comes up in a couple different places. It's like these small things that kind of keep you rooted to the story and what's happening, even if it's like present day, and you can still bring up the sweet potato and it takes you like, you're all of a sudden like pulled back into that, like, you know, tragic history that she's researching and still living through intergenerational.
Yeah, I read somewhere that like I think the prisoners got like 4 spoonfuls of very watery rice a day, which goes back to what you were saying, Sheela, about the mismanagement. And so I thought of that every time I saw like spoons coming up and how they were being used.
Yeah, I want to know more about her and her family. And like, because she's based in Pennsylvania now.
Well, I thought the note about the cover was interesting, especially because she talks about how that was the fabric that her grandmother created, and it was and she got some national art endowment for that, I think, which I thought was like, oh, that's really cool. You don't hear about that.
Nestor Weaver, who was recognized with the National Heritage Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts in 1990.
Yeah.
I really like the short notes at the end that I could quickly look back and be like, okay, that's what that was. I really like that, because I didn't read the end notes before. I know there was another
Gates.
Yeah, that one had a very more of a dense story, and that was. And when I was reading this, I was thinking about, and I read Gates more recently. I didn't read it and discuss it with you here. I read it independently for another group. And that was, the information I feel was more dense. The format was more dense. And then that glossary though. And so I didn't look back. And so when I got to the end, like, I was like, oh, this is a different sort of, and I liked going back to the poems then and finding the little pieces that she was explaining a little bit more about.
Maybe I was just like, after reading both Gates multiple times and now this multiple times, was there a Kissinger reference in Gates as well?
Can't remember.
I have a feeling that there was. And so now, like, if there was, there's now 2 sets of poetry we've read that make a pretty clear reference to Henry Kissinger and his like active role in destroying their countries.
Mm-hmm.
Just read that. I don't remember. I'm so curious now.
Yeah, I did think that that poem, "The Death of Henry Kissinger," in this collection was interesting on so many levels. First of all, to write about his death when it has not yet happened. But, you know, he's also someone who, like, he wrote the death, right, of so many people. So, but then it's also like this really interesting kind of, it's subverted in this way by these images of children sending these, you know, like bubbles and flying kites. And so I just, you know, it's one of those, another one where there's these 2 different levels to it, or this sort of dissonance. But then I think she said also rebirth as revenge. So it's like she's subverting it intentionally to allow this rebirth to happen. But that one was really, I really liked that one.
I didn't realize he wasn't dead. That blew my mind just now. Yeah, sorry. He's 98 years old, as Google tells me. But wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's awful.
I know, it's like there's so much you could say about that, but it's just like, is this where we want to say it?
I should be sitting here laughing like this, and I'm pressing mute.
I'm sorry, that might have been inappropriate. I had no idea.
Henry Kissinger, you know.
Wow.
Yeah. And again, like, it's all so wild to me as like, as somebody who was like, as like everyone else, like brought up in the American educational system, that we stopped basically right at around World War II, because God forbid we learn about all the other ways that the US has intervened, and the just like the constant meddling and violence. And then like on the flip side, we take no ownership or even like allow the survivors to come in without like all these restrictions placed upon them.
Or even
it's like we wreak havoc across the globe, and those people who we wreak havoc on, we're like, y'all are refugees and you cannot come to America, which, by the way, is the home of the brave and a melting pot that you don't get to come to. It's it's such a glaring, it's so hypocritical. It's so obvious. You want to punch a wall.
Well, I was reading the article that was sent with the note, May's reading note, about the Cambodians who were deported back to a home that they weren't, they've never known. So basically, during Trump's ruling, yeah, I guess I'll stay with that. America was deporting a lot of Cambodian refugees who'd been convicted of crimes, and I as I was reading that, I was really fascinated by the history of it, how refugees are housed in poor areas, not given access to the resources necessary to manage in the US. And in the case of Cambodians in particular, the article pulled out how children were having a hard time connecting with their parents, who were really deeply traumatized by what had happened. And so they found families in gangs and other spaces, and got involved in small and large crimes, and now are being sent, or didn't even know that they could apply to become citizens, and have now been sent back to Cambodia. And that there's actually organizations in Cambodia that's helping them settle in Cambodia, and that's actually offering them better refugee services than what we offer here. So it was just mind-blowing to me that this is kind of the state we're in. And it's not new, but it's still shocking in some ways.
Yeah, there was like a huge uptick in Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnamese deportations in like 2017, 2018. And even within the Asian American community, not spoken about, not seen as an immigration issue, not seen as like part of us, because they're refugees. They're not the good Asians. And so like we know, like within our own like larger umbrella, that there's a lot of like white supremacist ideas about who is deserving to be here and who isn't, and that we don't develop like a sense of solidarity alongside other folks within our community.
Yeah. Yeah. And definitely worth pointing out that this is by design. With U.S. immigration laws that have, first banning all immigration of Asians into the U.S. and then opening it up later to highly educated, highly skilled people, which suddenly created like this merit-based system that isn't truly, meritocracy, but just kind of perpetuating this idea that, some people are worthy of immigrating where others are not. And to be honest, a lot of people have bought into it. I've bought into it for a long time until I did some unlearning work around that. Yeah.
So for a set of poetry, I mean, I feel like this was our collection. It was really long. I guess I'm like used to like Dhaka Dust, which we read 2 years ago. We read Gates last year, and they were relatively short and condensed. And to be fair, I'm reading this on an e-reader, not in paperback. So it just feels like it's a lot lengthier. And I was just curious how other people felt about that. And I don't normally read poetry, so I should contextualize my bias there.
Well, I don't read a lot of poetry either, but this book, it's a very slim, little thin book. It's about 55 pages, and I didn't particularly think it was too long. I thought, I thought it was a great readable size, especially for the information. I thought if it were like half as long, I think we would be missing more of what she wanted to share.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of related to what you had said, Sheela, but also kind of not. I thought it was a good mix of short poems and long form poems, and poems that were made up of littler poems. So I think the variety of different lengths and forms, not in the way like a sonnet or a sestina, but like, I guess different size poems, lent itself to the book's readability. Some of these I could hunker down and say, all right, I'll be with this for a moment. Some of these I can say to myself, well, this will be a flash in the pan, a quicker encounter, if you will.
It's also
so I think that led to its me being able to read it and enjoy it. Enjoy is a funny word here, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I know. I did the same thing. I was like, it's my favorite. Well, too, I think it's interesting, speaking of like the length and how some of the poems are longer or shorter or different formats. Like the table of contents, there's 3 different sections, and section 2 is only 1 poem. And that for me is like that was the middle point where I like had to stop and be like, okay, that is the poem. So I think it's interesting that you have, and the other ones, there's like 10 poems in each section, but these sections 1, 2, and 3, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that speaks really to the poem that is its own section as well, because there are many pieces in that poem, but also it seems important to take a pause after that poem. I mean, both like in what you're, I mean, just mentally take a pause, and also there's a pause in the book because I think there's a lot in that particular poem.
And really, it's
sit with.
It's sort of the way it's kind of broken up. It's sort of smaller poems in my mind. Yeah, that little boy running. Keep just flipping through it.
I wanted to just quickly reflect on a point that Lucy made about was it Sestina? It's like, I don't know very much about the technicalities of poetry and the breadth and depth of options. But I did actively notice how much Sok played around with language. And I really appreciated, like in The Radio Brings News with the, not The Radio Brings News, sorry. The other the radio host goes into hiding, the playful use of language to uncover something so horrific. But also in Windfall, which is the 10th poem, there's an extended, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to pull it up as well. There's this extended metaphor of birds migrating when they can't find water and they can't find food for survival. But at the same time, and I don't know if this is what she meant, but there was a real, like a similar type of violence happening on the northwest side of the country. There's a province called Priya Vihar, and in that area, there's a really old, famous temple that is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but for the longest time was disputed land between Thailand and Cambodia. And there's like weird legal things there, but it became like a gray zone for human rights violations. And so after the Khmer Rouge was toppled over, which is like a weird thing to say because they still had influence, especially in the western side of the country, and people were freed from these re-education camps, they didn't know where to go. And they tried to go to like, there's this steep cliff on where this temple is. And they were told, you can go here. And then they were like basically forced off into like their death trying to get to Thailand. Mm-hmm. And so reading the line, let's see, the cranes near extension migrated to waters near Khmer Rouge holding, where no one dared go. Not that a mandate said keep out, no sign written in blood. That like brought me back to learning about that horrific, violent, very recent history in that part of Cambodia, like at the border of Thailand. And then later on in the poem, she mentions the the eastern border with Laos, and most of us are familiar with the silent, or what is it called, the Quiet War, the Silent War, where the U.S. dropped like a crap ton of bombs on Laos, and like nobody knew about it.
Yeah.
So this poem just like really, really like blew me away, and I wasn't expecting a poetry about birds to like be so visceral like that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that interpretation. This like really makes the poem even richer to me, because I think this was one of the ones that was easier for me to like fly through, to use a bird metaphor. But partly because I wasn't thinking about it at that level. I was thinking about environmental impact, and also just how everything has to shift because of the damage done. And I imagine I'm pretty sure that we don't know the full extent of the environmental impact from all of it, from the number of bombings that have happened. Yeah, so pretty cool. We're reaching the top of the hour, so I wanted to see if folks had any last thoughts you want to share, or something that we didn't get to cover about this book.
First of all, I want to say we're already at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
that felt like it went
really very fast. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you, as always, for bringing another book to the table that I wouldn't have happened upon. That's made like my experience as a reader even richer and more broad, and also makes me, thirsty for more information. It's a great book. It's a great book.
Yeah, I would second that. And thinking like, oh wow, this hour went by so quickly. I think part of that is because like I will turn a page and I'll look at any one of these poems and I'm like, oh wait, I want to dive into this with everyone sitting here, because I know that you all read this. And so I just think we probably could have talked for a lot more hours, and maybe that's why it went by quickly. So
And I just want to say thank you to the Ann Arbor District Library, as always, for having us. But I sincerely look forward to these conversations because I know we're going to get into some real interesting aspects of writing. And I don't get to do this during my day job. So to have this type of outlet is so, so, so fun. So thank you for having us and continuing to support the work that we do.
With that, next month, we're reading How to Pronounce Knife. It is a collection of short stories, and I'm very excited to dive into short stories again. So I hope that readers...
Oh no, Fatema, oh no, the internet cut out. But I think I can finish where she started. We hope that readers take the time to check the collection of short stories out, and we look forward to being back to talk about them with y'all.
Yeah, and thank you so much for being here tonight.